Although much of conventional Christian thinking and the concept of grace revolve around the idea of unmerited favor, a more in-depth look at the concept reveals much more. Grace is a foundational element of the Christian faith, often understood as the unearned love and kindness of God toward humanity. However, when we delve deeper into the scriptures and the theological implications of grace, we discover that it is a rich and multifaceted concept that encompasses empowerment, transformation, relational dynamics, and much more. To begin with, let's explore the Greek definition of grace, which is charis. This term conveys a sense of favor, goodwill, and kindness, but it also carries the connotation of a gift that enables or empowers. In the New Testament, grace is often associated with the idea of divine influence upon the heart, leading to a change in behavior. This understanding broadens our perspective, showing that grace is not merely about receiving unmerited favor. It also involves a response of obedience and faithfulness. For instance, in Romans 1:5, Paul speaks of the obedience that comes from faith. Here, grace is linked to a life of obedience, suggesting that true faith is evidenced by our actions. Similarly, in 2 Corinthians 9:8, Paul writes, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." This highlights that grace empowers us to engage in good works, reinforcing the idea that grace is active and transformative. While the traditional definition of grace as unmerited favor is crucial, it serves as just the starting point. Ephesians 2:8-9 emphasizes that salvation is a gift from God, not something we can earn through our own efforts. This foundational understanding highlights the incredible generosity of Elohim, who offers us grace freely, regardless of our shortcomings. Interestingly, grace also has conditions, particularly in relation to our faith and obedience. The examples of Noah and Abraham illustrate this beautifully. Both found grace in the eyes of Yahuwah, but their experiences were closely tied to their faithful responses to God's commands. Noah was described as a righteous man who walked faithfully with Elohim, and Abraham's faith was made complete by his actions. This suggests that while grace is freely given, it invites us to respond with obedience and trust, emphasizing the active nature of our faith. In John 14:15, Yahushua states, "If you love me, keep my commands." This indicates that grace involves a response of obedience to God's commands. Similarly, in Romans 1:5, Paul speaks of the obedience that comes from faith, suggesting that true faith is evidenced by obedience, which is a condition of experiencing God's grace. In Romans 6:1-2, Paul addresses the relationship between grace and sin, asking, "Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" This highlights that while grace is freely given, it calls for a response of obedience and a turning away from sin. In 1 Peter 1:13-16, Peter encourages believers to be holy and obedient, stating, "As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance." This reinforces the idea that grace is not a license to sin, but rather empowers believers to live in obedience to God. In the New Testament, grace is presented in relation to the law. Romans 6:14 tells us that we are no longer under the law, but under grace. However, it is essential to understand that grace does not liberate us from the law, rather it fulfills it. From the very beginning, in Genesis 3:15, we were promised that the seed of the woman would crush the power of sin. This promise points to the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan through Messiah, who embodies the law's intent and purpose. Grace empowers us to live in a way that reflects this fulfillment, enabling us to love and obey God genuinely. In summary, while grace is often described as unmerited favor, the biblical narrative shows that it is also conditional upon faith and obedience. The examples of Noah and Abraham illustrate that their experiences of grace were closely tied to their faithful responses to God's commands. This understanding emphasizes that grace is not merely a passive gift, but an active relationship that calls for obedience and trust in God.